Every evening, Mrs. Hargrove would sit by her window, watching the street. Her neighbor, Mr. Larkin, was a creature of habit. He'd leave for work at precisely 7:30 a.m. and return by 6:00 p.m. Until one day, he didn't. The next morning, his car was still parked, his lights still off. Days passed, and no one saw him. Curiosity turned to concern as neighbors whispered about his sudden absence. Mrs. Hargrove decided to investigate. She knocked on his door, but there was no response. She peered through the window and gasped. The living room was empty, devoid of any furniture or personal belongings, as if he'd never existed. She reported his disappearance, but when the police arrived, they dismissed her claims. The house, they insisted, had been vacant for years. Confused, Mrs. Hargrove checked old photographs she'd taken at neighborhood gatherings. In each one, Mr. Larkin's figure was blurred, as if he was never meant to be captured. That night, Mrs. Hargrove heard footsteps outside her window. She peered out to see Mr. Larkin staring back at her, his eyes hollow and cold. The next morning, Mrs. Hargrove's house stood empty, her presence erased. Neighbors whispered about the vanished woman who once watched the street, wondering who would disappear next.